Inflation, Part 2 and 3. The trial and learning continues. It's been probably about a week since Part 1, and this has been actually far more trial and learning than I had expected. When I started last week in Part 1, this was the model that I started with, which is a mess, and I'm not going to try and describe it, though I had taken this part of it, the demand and the supply, to attempt to use the standard model that's said to represent how supply and demand functions back and forth through price, and I couldn't get it to create inflation. So I went back to the drawing board and said, all right, let me build a new model. So I started from the beginning. And as I said, the way that I build models is based upon what I consider the piece that I want to understand. So I start with inflation and I say, what influences this and what does it influence? And I continue to work backward, piece by piece by piece, continuing to ask the same questions over and over again. And I ended up with this model, which I could have attempted to explain, though my experience is that I generally end up with a model that has more pieces in it that I actually need to explain what's happening. Not that the pieces aren't relevant, it's just they're not essential. There are, we continue to say that everything is connected, and it is pretty much, though the question is, which of the connected pieces are actually relevant to understanding the overall behavior of the system. So I will go ahead and I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to take pieces out of this model, and this is what I ended up with. So inflation, which is an increase in price over an extended period of time, is influenced by demand and supply. And the thing is, this is the relationship that I tried to simulate and couldn't produce inflation. And the realization was that price in this instance is actually influencing production, which is influencing finished product transportation, which produces a supply that can actually be delivered to those people with demand. Then when the pandemic shows up, it has an inverse effect on the economy, and the economy shifts the demand so that the demand for services diminishes, but the demand for durable goods increases, and the decrease or the impact on the economy has an effect on production, so that different producers cut back on the things that they know are not going to be in demand to the extent that they were before. Then the pandemic also is responsible for a labor shortage, which in fact diminishes production, diminishes the number of truck drivers available, and has an influence on straining supply chains, both the labor shortage and truck drivers. And the truck drivers, in fact, diminishing the truck drivers diminishes the finished product transportation, which has an influence on the supply. And it's that piece that I think causes the supply not to respond to the demand, which is responsible for the inflation. In addition to that, with the onset of the pandemic, China began exporting PPE to all corners of the world, which ended up with shipping containers in all of these places that didn't have anything to ship back to China. And as a consequence, the shipping containers simply piled up at the ports because the resources weren't there to load them on the ships to take them back to the source. And shipping empty containers around the world is not a money-making proposition. So the shipping containers ended up in all the wrong places, which ended up having a negative influence on on finished product transportation, which end up diminishing the supply. Additionally, um, I also had a problem with the influence on the supply chain and realized that there was actually two supply chains that I was trying to understand. One was production of finished product, creating supply, and the production of components that have to go through some supply chain to actually be part of production. And it was here that just-in-time manufacturing ended up showing up as a difficulty, because it seems that lots of organizations or companies implemented just-in-time manufacturing by looking at the cover of the book but without reading it, and didn't realize that just-in-time is actually supposed to be just in case, so that you have to understand which components of the manufacturing process are critical components and are at risk of not being available. So while it's relatively easy to cut back on production, once you cut back on production, it's sometimes difficult to ramp back up, to turn things back on, and it takes time. So that the just-in-time manufacturing, which typically directly influences production, ends up producing reliance on imports and the strained supply chain, diminishes the component supply, which has a negative influence on production, so that things get held up. Now, the example that I came up with, which is a terrible example, is if women decide to stop having babies, there are many babies in the pipeline, but once the pipeline is empty, if women decide to start having children again, you can't have one for 9 months because of the physical, biological nature of the scenario. And the production system is like that also, where it's easy to stop something, and once the pipeline is deplete of all of the things that are already in transit, getting the pipeline filled back up again takes time. So this is my current understanding of the, I think, and when recovery measures go into effect and diminish the pandemic, and the economy begins to grow, demand increases, and there's a demand for more production, but it takes time for production to catch up with the demand, so the supply is diminished over an extended period of time, resulting in an increase in price over a period of time and inflation. And if you think about what happened for some period of time, gas prices went down because people weren't driving so much. So because there was an oversupply, though once we began driving more and more back up, gas prices went back up, because the demand became commensurate with the supply that was there. So it's an intertwined set of relationships that one can ponder for quite some time. And if you look at the model that I used to develop this with, there are a whole bunch of references that I looked at, that I read to do this, that you can access in Diigo. Some of them have highlighted parts that I highlighted when I read them. And the model itself is in multiple parts. All right, there's the first part, the second part, and the third part. And if you have a Kumu account, you can go to this model, and the link to the model itself is in the musing. You can go to any one of these items, you can click on it, and you can start a discussion thread about that particular item. If you have questions, want further clarification or whatever. And also the model is public, so that you can go to this function here within Kumu, and you can actually create a version of this product or model that belongs to you, and you can do anything you want to with it. So hope this has been informative, and I'm sorry it's so long, but sometimes they just take longer than expected. So take care. Bye.